So welcome back. We're going to turn our focus now to productive skills. And I'd like to start with an activity. And for this activity, you need three things. Pen and paper and a partner. Okay, and a partner. So please find one person you can work with. And we're going to do a little writing activity. And what I'd like you to do is on a piece of paper, write a question to your partner. Okay, we're going to have a little conversation on paper. So write a question to your partner, exchange papers, answer the question, and finish with a question back to your partner, kind of like this. How was your journey to the conference today, for example? Swap papers, answer it, and finish with another question back to your partner. So let's see how this activity runs for a couple of minutes, passing your papers back and forth, having a little conversation on paper, and then we'll talk about it, okay? One question to start with, swap papers, and then answer the question and finish with a question back to your partner. Okay, I think you kind of get the idea of how the activity works. And some of you might be wondering, what's the point of having a conversation on paper? Why not just speak, right? In the workshop for the second half today, we're going to look at these parts of the exam, language functions and writing. And language functions is the way the 8th grade exam addresses speaking. But it doesn't actually require students to speak, which might sound a little bit strange. It sounds a bit strange to me. You can think of it like speaking without the speaking. So this activity that you've just done is speaking without speaking, and asking students to write down a conversation that they would like to have gives everybody a chance to participate. It encourages or allows some of the quieter students to get some speaking practice on paper, and it also kind of mimics what they'll be doing on the exam. So we're going to look at language functions and writing. And we're going to start with knowledge of language functions. And an overview of the paper, it looks something like this. There's closed tasks as well as open tasks. We'll be looking at both today. And the score share is 15 to 20%. So again, knowledge of language functions, it's like speaking without the speaking. So here's an example of an exam task. Again, in repetitorium, the exam tasks are noted with the red circled check mark. And the tasks look something like this. Easy, kind of average, difficult. What do you think? Looks pretty difficult. So I'd like you to think of a couple ideas. How could you prepare students for this type of exam task? Just take a minute or two with your partners. How would you prepare students for a task like this in one of your classes? Okay, just 2 minutes with the partner, and then we'll discuss some ideas. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me show you one possibility. So this type of open task is pretty demanding, right? It's pretty demanding. It's testing students' awareness of functional language, and oftentimes setting some kind of context is quite useful. Language without context could potentially be meaningless. So I would like to suggest taking a step-by-step approach to this type of task and not starting by asking students to just do the exam task. If you think back to the previous workshop, we talked about reading strategies, and I had said a gist task to read the whole text and then just do it, and the strategy comes in after. For this type of exam task, I don't think that's the best strategy, right? Not to start with that type of strategy in September with your students. So a step-by-step approach means step one, setting a clear context for how this language will be used. If you look at that picture, what do you think the context is for the activity that we're going to look at? Does anybody know this picture? Does anybody recognize it from a book, possibly? Yeah? Well, it's a hotel. Yeah. Believe it or not, it's a hotel. Typical hotel? Unusual hotel. Okay, so we know we're going to have some kind of text related to an unusual hotel. I think this unusual hotel is in Switzerland, possibly? Sweden or Switzerland? I can't remember which country. And if you look at the task here, we have an open task which requires students to put one word into the gap, one piece of a functional expression. So we have a clear context of hotels. We have a kind of simplified version of the exam task. Step two, now we can see a dialogue. It's starting to look more like the exam task now, much more like the exam task. And now we're focusing students' attention on functional pieces of language, and they have to insert a short phrase to complete the functional expression, and then the next step would be, bang, exam task. So building up to these types of tasks step by step is one approach to take in this knowledge of language functions. And you might be wondering, okay, well, where does this language come from? The language can come from the course book, and these types of boxes, which have nice big lists of different chunks of language, different functional chunks of language. But providing the language isn't always enough. Just giving students a list of words, there you go, you're ready for the test. There's got to be some way to activate this language and to get students to do something with it. So if we have these two boxes, for example, the task is students have to match sentence halves. This would be a nice chance to use the game memory. And you can have strips of paper with sentences from the top box on one side, strips of paper with sentences from the bottom box, and students turn them over to try and match them. So we're providing the language, but also asking students to do something with it. In this case, a matching activity. Bingo could also be used. Did you guys ever play bingo in your classes? Yeah, bingo's lots of fun. In your squares, you can have short little functional expressions, right? There's lots of possibilities with these lists of words and phrases. So we looked previously at a conversation that might take place in a hotel, and another example of quite a realistic context for using language, for using natural language, natural functional language, is at the cinema. This is a activity taken from English class, and students get the tape script. Of course, they have the audio as well. And in this case, the video. Also, we have a DVD lesson. So we're going to watch a short video that takes place at the cinema. And what I'd like you to do is try and write down all the functional chunks of language that you hear in the cinema that could be used in any occasion in the cinema. Let's see how many you can get.
So, what's on?
The new Tom Lewis movie, True Love. It starts in 10 minutes.
No way! I want to see Zoo World.
I don't like fantasy films. They're boring.
Oh, come on, please.
Oh, okay.
Can I have 2 tickets for Zoo World, please?
Sure, which screening?
The 6:30?
I'm sorry. It's sold out. Oh, no, hold on. There are 2 seats,
Great.
but they're in the front row.
Lee, I don't want to sit in the front row.
Okay. I'd like 2 for True Love at 6:15, please.
Row 7, is that okay?
Yes, thanks. How much is that?
It's £12.50, please.
Here you are.
Thank you. Enjoy the film.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so functional language, you can just shout out the expressions that you heard. Yes? Which screening? Yeah. Yes. Okay, there was quite a few examples. Now, this task that I gave you might be a little bit too demanding for some of our students. And one way to grade that activity could be to provide the language, so key phrases in a box like this. And what could students do as they watch? Instead of writing down each phrase, they could tick the ones they hear, right? Possibly they could order them. There's a few possibilities. So again, not only providing language, but activating the language and getting students to do something with it is much more helpful, especially with exam preparation. And a book like English class also contains an element of contrastive analysis. And if you remember way back to the beginning of the first workshop, a possible area of difficulty for students is when they have to translate or use this mediation skill. And this is one way to approach it, asking students, okay, how do you say these functional expressions in your language? But of course, there can be some problems there as well. How many of you use some kind of translator, either in your personal lives or at work? Anybody? I use a translator all the time. I use a translator oftentimes to translate work emails that I get. And what I do is I cut and paste the whole email, usually, into a translator, and I push translate. And then I read the English version, and I think, what? I don't... They're not perfect. So I end up going between the English version back to the Polish version. The confusing parts in English, I check the Polish expressions with what I kind of already know in Polish, and I can piece things together. But there's lots of problems that come up in using this kind of direct translation. My students are also big fans of using translators. One tip that I give them, if you're going to use a translator, not in class, of course, but at home, if you're going to use a translator, don't put in a single word, but put a sentence or a phrase, or better yet, a collocation into the translator. They will possibly get a better translation. But there's lots of problems that come up with translation. Here's a few examples of some problematic areas of translation. Is A or B the correct translation here? B? Yeah? That was my guess as well. Yes, I think it's also B. Another example? B as well, I think. My guess was also B. Context is quite important here, right? We've got some isolated pieces of language which make the translation a lot trickier, right? Kind of shows the importance of providing language in context. Here, salute your parents, right? Maybe some of us might salute our in-laws or feel like we should, possibly, but and one more example. which gives a nice example of the danger of using direct translation. And something I like about the last one is you can probably imagine the context for this type of expression, right? At the end of an email where you're requesting something, maybe from a colleague or someone. So let's look at an activity that we can use in the class to help students manage and work on this mediation skill. For this activity, you need a partner, only one partner. And I'm going to ask you to translate a short text. And there's going to be text A and text B. So with your partners, please decide who will be A and who will be B. Who will be B. I'll show you a text in English, and your job is to translate your text into Polish. And don't look at the other text. Okay? Are you ready? Here we go. So please translate this into Polish. Only translate your exchange. If you're A, translate A, B, translate B, please. Okay. Now, with your partner, exchange papers and translate the Polish text back into English. So swap papers with your partner and translate their Polish back into English, please. Okay, ready to check? So here's the English version again. So this is, I think, a nice way to practice this mediation skill. Does anybody know what this type of translation is called? There's a couple names for it: two-way translation or double translation. Can your students do this? You think your students can do this? I think they probably can. Yeah, I think they probably can. Of course, it depends on the dialogue. It depends on the text. But it's a nice way to practice a bit of translation. So knowledge of language functions, we looked at these areas, using realistic dialogues and taking a step-by-step approach, especially to those open tasks, and introducing this element of contrastive analysis and this two-way translation activity. It's a nice way to prepare students for some of the translation tasks they might have on the exam. Okay, moving on to writing. Now, I'm not sure how you guys address writing in your classes. How many of you give writing for homework? Yeah, a few people. How many people give writing for homework? Okay, me too. That's one thing I like to do, give writing for homework. When I worked in a private language school, I've had adults flat out refuse to write in class. And they said, "John, we'll do it for homework." And I said, "No, you won't." Please do it now. And writing is a skill, in my experience, that demands some attention in the classroom. So the writing paper looks something like this. There's one task. They have to elaborate on 3 items. And here's a few examples of the types of text they'll have to produce. and the score share is around 20%. So speaking and writing are the two productive skills that we're looking at, and they don't always translate. A good writer is not a good speaker, and vice versa, in my opinion. And when we prepare students for an exam task, obviously exam practice is a nice way to go. Here's a task. The task is in Polish originally, but I've translated it into English. And this is the task that we're going to look at. So before we ask students to write, what's something they might need to know before they sit down to write? Vocabulary, of course. Grammar, vocabulary. Absolutely. It also might be useful for students to know how they'll be assessed, right? What is the marking criteria? What's the assessment criteria? So I'd like to go through the grading criteria on the writing paper. The first category, what's another word for task achievement, starting with C? Content, yeah, good, it's content. Content's worth 4 points. And content is marked more or less according to this table. How many items they refer to, and also how many items they elaborate on. Next, logical structure, organization, or, yeah, good. Coherence, cohesion. 2 points there. Scope. Yeah, scope of language. So using a variety of different pieces of vocabulary and grammar structures. Also 2 points. And finally, correctness. Yeah, accuracy, right? Accuracy. So if we look at the way the 10 points are divided, it's quite heavy on content. And to me, that's quite good news, right? That's very good news. Younger learners, students in general, might have difficulty with accuracy. They might have difficulty with range. Coherence, using linking devices, also could be problematic, but when it comes to content, they should have something to say, right? Depending on the topic they get, but they should have something to say. So I like to see more points given for content and developing these topics. So let's look at a sample answer, okay? I've prepared this sample answer. It's not perfect, and what I'd like you to do is mark it. Okay, is to grade this. How many points would you give this out of 10? Please feel free to confer with a colleague. I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll check. And remember, these are the areas you should focus on. How many points for content? Once again? 4, and the rest of the categories, 2 points each, right? 2 points each, for a total of 10. So how many points would you give out of 10? 2 or 3 minutes with a colleague, and then we'll check together, okay? Would you like to see the task? Okay, the task. There's the task. They're the same. They're the same task. Asking to see the task again. You're very good teachers. Fantastic. Okay, ready to see the answer? Okay, here we go. Back to the answer. There we go. How many points? Okay. Okay. So who was over 5? Raise your hand if you were more than 5 points. More, over 5. Over 5. Some of you were under 5. You guys are tough markers, tough teachers. Wow. 6 or more? Just keep your hands up. 7 or more? 8, 9, 10? Anyone? 10? Ah, okay. I think between 6 and 8. In my opinion, let me tell you why. Okay. In terms of content, we have when, what happened, which is mentioned and expanded on, but the effect it had on the writer is not really included. It's not really included. There was a great crowd, the atmosphere was great, but it doesn't quite describe the effect it had on the writer, right? So there's one content area that's missing here. What was the second grading criteria? Do you remember? Cohesion and structure. If we look at the middle portion, I mean, overall, it's not horribly organized. There's a beginning, middle, and end, right? Which is quite good. But there's not really any linking devices, right? We don't really have any linkers. So I would probably go for one point out of 2 on cohesion and structure. What was the next criteria? Scope. Yeah, scope of language. The word great is repeated several times, right? So probably 1 out of 2 on scope of language, probably not full marks here in my opinion. And accuracy, maybe that was the first thing that we noticed, right? Is the past, there's missing some past verb forms, right? Some past verb forms. So probably only 1 on correctness of language. So around, I would say around 6 or 7, 8, I think 8 or 9 is pretty generous. But it could be a nice motivating tool for students. Okay. So how can we develop these areas? If we want students to get better, there's a couple ways we can develop this. First of all, we need a sample answer. And we can write the sample answer ourselves. And if it's used with multiple groups, quite a good way to spend our time. Or if you're using a course book, you can take the sample from the book. And on the left, we've got an example from Repetitorium, which asks students to translate a portion of the text. And on the right is a text from English class, which asks students to make predictions and then read the letter before they have to write their own task. They're reading to check their predictions. So we're going to look at developing some of these writing sub-skills, and they basically follow the grading criteria: content, scope, accuracy, and cohesion. And we'll start with generating content. What was the topic of this writing task that we marked? Yeah, a sporting event. So with a partner, you've got 30 seconds to write down, to brainstorm, to collaborate and brainstorm as many words and phrases you can think of related to a sporting event. Okay? 30 seconds with a partner, go. Okay, time's up. I think it was about 30 seconds. You can compare your list with mine, see if you have any of the same answers. Anybody referee? Yeah, spectators? Okay. So this type of activity, which practices generating content, involves collaboration and brainstorming, which are two quite powerful tools to use in the classroom. And this is something students can do before they write, of course. And when we work with these types of word lists, I think in the last workshop I asked you about using, if you use word lists in class, we had that activity where students describe a list of words, 5 or 6 words, using synonyms or antonyms. We can also use word lists in terms of this brainstorming activity as well. So not all the content has to come directly from what the students already know. So moving on to improving students' cohesion and structure using these linking devices. I've got a little activity that I'd like to do with you. And we're going to use some of the linkers at the bottom here, some of these sequencing devices. Take a look at the basket of fruits. What's your favorite type of fruits from that picture? Apples, strawberries. Okay, let's use strawberries. This is another kind of dictation activity, but don't worry, you don't have to write everything I say. I'm going to read a text to you, and when there's a linking device in the text, I'm going to say strawberry. And you've got to write down which linker goes in the gap. And again, it's one of the linkers we can see here. There'll be 5 strawberries total. Okay, 5 strawberries total. So when you hear the word strawberry, write down a linker from the list. I dreamt that I uploaded the video of my song on YouTube. Strawberry, it wasn't very successful. Only 3 people viewed the video in the first week. But then, Strawberry, it became popular. Millions of people saw it. A few days, Strawberry, I got a call from a music company and I went to London to make a professional video. That was really successful too. Strawberry, they asked me to write the music for a Hollywood movie. Strawberry, I won an Oscar for the best original song in a film. Please compare your strawberries with your partner. Okay, well, here is the text. Number 2, suddenly. Number 3, later. Number 4, next. After that, both fit. And number 5. Sorry, number 4 can also be finally, of course, and number 5 in the end. Yeah, in the end. I made the strawberries a little bit more difficult. I didn't say in the strawberry, I just said strawberry. You guys are teachers, so I had to make it a little bit more difficult. So this type of activity appears in English class, and students could do this activity and then use the workbook activity in the way that I've just done it. And it kind of turns a writing activity into a speaking activity, which provides a little bit of variation. And if you think back to the knowledge of language functions, that's kind of speaking without speaking kind of part of the exam, it also can be used to practice the knowledge of language functions. Of course, these linking devices are used in speaking and writing, right? Another approach to this is using students' first language to provide the category or the function of this linking device and then give some examples. This is just a slightly different approach to take. And the last two categories of the marking criteria for writing were about range and accuracy, right? Range and accuracy. So let's look at a couple ways to improve students' scope and correctness of language. When it comes to writing, some common areas of difficulty that students have in writing and speaking. Here's a few areas. There's probably a few other areas that come to mind. Verb phrases you might add to this list. We've got prepositions already, articles, of course. And one thing that I like to do is to collect examples of writing from my students. Not always entire text, sometimes just individual sentences. And here's some that I've collected over the years, some things that my students have written. I think the first one is Drogie Maria. Drogie Maria. Drogie Maria. With best regrets. I like that one, with best regrets. So one thing that I like to do is collect some sentences like this and ask students to correct them. And this kind of represents a reactive approach to writing. And if we look here, here's some possible mistakes that students might make. Now, one of those isn't exactly a mistake. Which one is kind of correct? I was at the match. There's not really a grammatical mistake there. But how could we improve this? I went to the match is better. I attended the match is even better. So we can use this reactive approach not only for error correction, but to upgrade or improve students' language. And we talked about accuracy, but also range, right? Also scope. So we can take this example, I was at the match, which basically represents overuse of the verb to be. Is that a problem that you've experienced? Is students using the verb to be all the time? For me as well, and I regularly teach at a university. I get a lot of high-level, C1 level students, and they do the same thing still at the C1 level. And what I started realizing was they need to avoid using the verb to be so often, right? So I attended the match. So we can include examples of mistakes, which are problems with accuracy, but also examples of sentences that show a limited range of vocabulary or grammar, right, which need to be improved on. We can have language that doesn't sound quite natural, mistakes with collocations, which aren't exactly grammar mistakes, but they're still problems that need to be worked on. And not only problematic language, but we should also include good language in this area to praise students for coming up with some nice expressions. And after all, our students have different vocabularies, they have different abilities, and they don't only have to learn from us as teachers, they can also learn from each other, which is one of the ideas behind collaboration, communicative language teaching, pair work, and so on. So this differential feedback, on the bottom we have language, some examples to praise and encourage students for using good language, so something like positive reinforcement. And at the bottom, some more challenging language, some problematic languages that needs to be corrected or improved or upgraded. So again, not only focusing on things like grammatical mistakes. So if I give my students writing for homework, I don't always mark every single paper. I'll take one or two sentences, maybe just one sentence from each student. Depending on class size, I'll collect about 10 or 12 sentences, put them on a worksheet, and ask students to correct them in class with a partner. One thing that I like to do is out of 10 sentences, I'll tell my students, okay, 9 of them have problems, 1 of them is correct, to raise the level of challenge slightly. And if you think about giving students a worksheet that looks like this, if you've got these 3 sentences here, how could we give some extra support for students? It could be quite challenging. The third one, I was at the match, there's no mistake. Your students might see it and say, it's fine. So what could you do to kind of direct their attention at the area that you want them to change? You could underline it. right? You can underline it. So you can provide some example sentences instead of having essentially no support for students. You can underline the parts that they should correct. Sometimes in brackets, I put things like verb tense, word order. If it's from writing, then punctuation, because this also works with feedback on speaking. So you can develop your own system, right? Whichever way works best for you. Underlining the parts that need to be corrected might be the easiest way to do it, or the most straightforward way to provide some additional support. Now, in English class, there's a slightly different approach here. You get these watch out boxes which show examples of confusing words or some problem areas for students, which also helps to develop their range of vocabulary. The first example, online, being used in 2 different ways. So improving their knowledge of how the word online is used, and also just some confusing words. You might have a watch out box with work and job, for example. And of course, collocations, right? Let's not forget about collocations. I'm a big fan of the lexical approach and developing collocations with students, which can be done with verb-noun collocations. They're everywhere, right? These verb-noun collocations. I'm going to test your knowledge of verb-noun collocations, focusing on go, do, and play. I'm just going to flash a sport or activity, and I want you to tell me the correct verb that collocates. Good. Okay. So with a group of students, I'd probably ask them to write these down, right? Ask them to write these things down. And what they should write down is the whole collocation, obviously not just play, do, go, and so on, but they get the whole collocation. And that way they leave class with a written record of what they've done that day, with an accurate written record. Okay. So eventually, we have to stop preparing, and students actually have to write their answers. And when they finish writing, what's next? What comes after writing? Finished, go home, play some video games, have dinner, go to sleep. Write again. Well, they can check. They can proofread their text, right? They can check it for mistakes. And I like to encourage my students to check more than once, because sometimes once isn't quite enough. And if they check it once and they change something, it's worth reading the text again to see if there's something else they might want to change. And let me show you an activity that kind of shows the importance of checking more than once. I'm going to show you a sentence, only for about 10 seconds, and you've got to count the number of letter Fs that you see in the sentence. Don't worry, there's no bad words. But count the number of Fs that you see. I'm only going to put it up for about 10 seconds. Here we go. Okay, that's long enough. 5 seconds. How many Fs? We have 5. Well, there were 6. There were 6. Check again. Which Fs did you forget? Yeah, those pesky little grammar words, right? Those pesky grammar words. So checking a text more than once can provide some additional correction for students, some additional self-correction. Once again, the materials for the workshop today were taken from these 2 courses, which again provide lots of language and skills development, exam practice, and strategy training.